The Virginia Burgess, in its first session, included plans to provide a school as a method to civilize and Christianize the, quote, savage neighborhood. The savage designation was a common usage in early colonial times, with various connotations, but generally implying someone uncivilized and to be feared. Ben Franklin, in his autobiography, stated, I quote,
"And indeed, if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum be the appointed means."
Unquote. And of course there is the more memorable historical quote variations, stemming purportedly from an exclamation uttered by General Philip Sheridan, quote, "The only good Indians I know are dead," unquote. As we have discussed earlier, up to and beyond the Revolutionary War, the Cherokee made regular war against Virginia as well as the Carolinas and Georgia frontier. British agents supplied the ammunition. All land back to the Mississippi was claimed under colonial charters, however. Tennessee settlements were still part of North Carolina, and Kentucky was considered to be part of Virginia, Western Virginia. But by 1790, more than 70,000 settlers were believed to be residing in what is today the state of Kentucky. Ostler writes that colonial aggressors were collectively referred to as, quote, Virginians, especially among the frontier tribes extending into the Ohio country, where Chota became a kind of native gathering focus point. Edward Teach, or Blackbeard, 1680 to 1718, brought the country into a flourishing condition. His tombstone reads, quote, "and died much lamented," unquote. Blackbeard had no grave, though. His body was thrown into Pamlico Sound, his head given as a trophy to Alexander Spotswood, governor of Virginia. The head was displayed at Hampton Roads. Many of the captured accomplices of Blackbeard were hanged and left to rot in gibbets along Williamsburg's Capitol Landing Road, which became known as Gallows Road. The Atlantic Tidewater presented early pioneers considerable misery and survival challenges early on. Following on the heels of Christopher Columbus's stumbling onto the islands of the Caribbean and tentative explorations of other ship captains like Florentine Giovanni de Verrazzano. Verrazzano apparently did not enter the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays, but mistakenly thought Pamlico Sound, further south, could be the passage to the Pacific Ocean. Subsequently, Florida's Spanish expeditions sought to undermine and eventually destroy the Jamestown settlement. Their efforts failed, and Jamestown began to accumulate power after importing unmarried women and sorting them to male inhabitants who could cover the cost of their transportation. The first black slaves purportedly arrived in Virginia about 1619, and it was they who supercharged a new tobacco production culture on great estates that spread across eastern Virginia. According to Bolton and Marshall, the population of Virginia expanded rapidly between 1625 and 1635. Quote, "When Charles I came to the English throne, Virginia's roughly 19 settlements contained about 1,200 inhabitants, of whom nearly 500 were servants and about 100 were children. Jamestown had about 33 houses and 175 inhabitants. By 1635, the population of the settlements had increased to 5,000. Subsequently, fully 100 years before the American Revolution, Virginia endured a surge of Indian violence and frontier settlement rebellion, led initially by a man from Henrico County, namely Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon's rebellion resulted in political and social anarchy, for a while stretching from the banks of the Potomac and Chesapeake Bay to the forests inland. With the King of England's interventions, the rebels eventually were pardoned, although some were hanged anyway, and Bacon himself died. Northeast Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland by then were notable plantation colonies or tobacco colonies. By 1683, about 12,000 indentured workers and 3,000 slaves labored in Virginia's expanding agricultural enterprises. Initially heavily invested in tobacco and hogs, but in contrast to the aristocratic plantation owners, many being Episcopalians of the Tidewater, inland and mountain frontier areas were populated by Scotch, Irish, and Germans, mostly of Presbyterian and Pietist religious inclinations. For protection from natives, blockhouses and forts began to sprout up across the region, such as Fort Ligonier, Fort Chiswell, Fort Byrd, Fort Loudon, etc. Later, this backcountry of Virginia in the 18th century became a kind of focal point of the French and Indian War, roughly lasting from 1754 to 1763. The frontier folks began to feel their moxie, huddled as they were in what is now West Virginia and Kentucky. At 1777, during the Revolutionary War period, Kentucky, with her present boundaries, was organized as the Kentucky County of Virginia. Emigrants to the frontier from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania at one time pleaded to be recognized as the 14th original state of Wetsylvania, consisting of West Virginia, southwestern Pennsylvania, and parts of Kentucky, Maryland, and Virginia. They were unsuccessful. George Washington began farming at Mount Vernon in 1758. According to the plantation records, 20 slaves assisted the future first president of the United States. After marrying Martha Dandridge Custis the following year, slave help increased to about 50. A complete census of his estate, around 1786, listed 216 men, women, and children, including some from the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. Given its location on the banks of the Potomac River, south of the District of Columbia and future capital of the United States, shad and herring runs were harvested off the farm's banks every season, assisting with the property's revenues.